Hospitals hold their fair share of whispered secrets. I'd spent over a decade as a night shift nurse, hearing unsettling anecdotes shared over coffee breaks or hushed conversations at the nurses' station. I never imagined I'd find myself at the center of one. It was a quiet evening in late January, the kind of shift most of us welcomed. With only a few patients in critical care, the floor had a calm, almost eerie stillness. One of my patients, Mr. Thomas, a frail man in his 70s, had been in a deep coma for 3 weeks. His condition was stable, though there was little hope he'd ever regain consciousness. His family had already said their farewells, and most of us were prepared for the inevitable. Earlier that evening, I checked his vitals, and everything seemed routine. Still, I couldn't shake a strange feeling that the night held something different. As I made my way down the dimly lit corridor toward Mr. Thomas's room around 2 a.m., an odd sound caught my attention. The faint hum of monitors was interrupted by what sounded like a soft murmur, a low, indistinct whisper coming from farther down the hallway. I paused, straining to discern words, but as soon as I stopped walking, the noise vanished. Brushing it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, I continued to Mr. Thomas's room, mentally reviewing his chart to stay focused. Pushing open the door quietly, I stepped inside, prepared for the usual silence of his room. But what greeted me was anything but ordinary. Mr. Thomas, the man who had been unresponsive for weeks, was awake. His thin frame lay motionless except for his eyes, which blinked slowly as they stared at the ceiling. I froze, my pulse quickening at the sight. His once dull, lifeless gaze now carried a faint glimmer of awareness, a spark that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Thomas?" I called softly, trying to mask the unease in my voice. He turned his head ever so slightly, his sunken eyes meeting mine. For a moment, I wasn't sure he recognized me, but then he nodded, a small yet deliberate gesture. "Doctor," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "She's leaving tonight." A chill prickled the back of my neck. "Who's leaving, Mr. Thomas?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. His gaze drifted past me, focusing on something over my shoulder. I resisted the urge to turn around, a cold weight settling in my stomach. His expression softened, a serene calm spreading across his features. "She's waiting," he murmured, his voice trailing off as his eyes returned to the ceiling. I stood there, momentarily speechless. I'd encountered patients who spoke of strange visions near the end of their lives, confusion, hallucinations, fleeting moments of lucidity, but this felt different. His certainty, the calm authority in his words, unsettled me deeply. I regained my composure and made quick notes in his chart, trying to brush off the nagging unease. Maybe it was just a byproduct of his condition, I told myself. And yet, as I checked his vitals and adjusted his medication, his words echoed in my mind, "She's leaving tonight." As I turned to leave, his whisper cut through the stillness again. "She's here," he said, his voice as soft as the rustle of fabric. I froze, looking back at him. His gaze was locked on the door, his eyes wide and unblinking. My own eyes followed his line of sight, but the doorway was empty. "Who's here, Mr. Thomas?" I asked gently, stepping closer to him. He didn't answer. His stare remained fixed on the empty doorway, his breathing steady but shallow. An uneasy knot twisted in my stomach. I backed out of the room, casting one last glance at him before closing the door behind me. Back at the nurse's station, I found Emily, a seasoned nurse in her 40s, preparing charts for the morning shift. I debated whether to share what had just happened, not wanting to sound foolish, but the need to voice my unease overpowered my hesitation. "Emily," I began, trying to sound casual, "has Mr. Thomas ever shown signs of lucidity before?" She frowned, glancing up from her paperwork. "Not since he was admitted." "Why? Did something happen?" I hesitated, then recounted what I'd just witnessed, the sudden awareness in his eyes, his cryptic comments about someone leaving, and his fixation on the doorway. Emily's expression grew serious as I spoke. "You're not the first to mention something like that," she said, her voice low. "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning closer. "There's been talk among the staff," she admitted. "Some patients, especially those close to the end, say strange things. They'll talk about someone waiting for them or about seeing people who aren't there. It's like they know when it's their time." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I'd heard stories before, of course, tales passed around during slow nights about patients who claimed to see loved ones or shadowy figures before they passed. But hearing it from Emily, someone who wasn't prone to superstition, made it harder to dismiss. Has anyone mentioned anything like this recently? I asked, my voice quieter now. She nodded toward a room farther down the hall. Room 314, she said. The woman in there passed away last night. One of the nurses said she kept talking about a visitor. But when they checked, the hallway was empty. A cold wave of unease washed over me. I hadn't been on shift the night before, but the connection was hard to ignore. Could it really be coincidence? Trying to shake off the unsettling feeling, I resumed my rounds, but the sensation of being watched clung to me. Every shadowy corner and empty room seemed to harbor an unseen presence, a weight in the air that I couldn't explain. Around 3 a.m., the faint beep of a monitor broke the silence. Checking my watch, I realized it was coming from Mr. Thomas's room. My heart quickened as I made my way down the hallway. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, the quiet almost oppressive. When I entered the room, Mr. Thomas was once again awake, sitting upright this time, his pale face illuminated by the soft glow of the monitor. "You're awake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled faintly, his gaze steady and clear. "I feel lighter," he said softly, his tone serene. "It's like I've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and now it's gone." I opened my mouth to ask him more, but before I could speak, the monitor flatlined. His smile lingered as his body relaxed, his head tilting gently to the side. I froze, staring at the peaceful expression on his face. The room seemed to grow colder, the silence wrapping around me like a shroud. Later that morning, as I updated his chart, Emily approached me with a somber expression. "Did you hear? The patient in room 314 passed away around the same time as Mr. Thomas." I nodded, the weight of the night pressing heavily on me. I didn't share what I'd seen, not even with her. The connection between his words and what had unfolded was something I wasn't ready to confront. Even now, years later, I can't walk past that room without feeling the echo of his final words, "She's here." I leaned closer, intrigued yet unnerved by what Emily had said. "What exactly do you mean by that?" I asked carefully, not wanting to reveal how much her words had unsettled me. She sighed, glancing down the hallway, her voice dropping into a whisper. "There are stories," she began. "Patients who are near the end, sometimes they say things. It's like they know something we don't. Some talk about seeing someone waiting for them, almost like they're being guided." Her expression was calm, but the weight of her words carried an undeniable gravity. A chill coursed through me, the kind you feel when the air suddenly shifts. I'd heard nurses swap stories like these in passing, patients claiming to see loved ones or shadowy figures before their final moments. I'd always dismissed it as medication-induced hallucinations or a trick of the mind, but there was something about the way Emily said it, her quiet sincerity, that made me reconsider. I hesitated, then asked, "Has anyone said something like this recently?" Emily's gaze flicked toward one of the rooms at the far end of the hallway. "Room 217, she said, her voice barely audible. "The woman there passed last night. One of the night nurses told me she'd mentioned a visitor, someone coming to see her. But when they checked the hall, it was empty." Her words lingered in the air, thick and heavy. I hadn't been on shift the night before, but the thought of another patient witnessing the same thing made my skin crawl. Could it really just be coincidence? I forced myself to focus, shaking off the unsettling feeling as I resumed my rounds. Yet as the hours stretched on, I couldn't escape the sensation of being watched. Every time I passed an unoccupied room or glanced into the shadowed corners of the hallway, I felt a presence, faint but undeniable, as though someone lingered just out of sight. The silence of the night shift, usually soothing in its predictability, had become oppressive. Around 3:12 a.m., the stillness was broken by the soft beep of a monitor down the hall. I glanced at my watch, noting the time. Most of the staff had already gone home, leaving only a skeleton crew to manage the floor. The corridor stretched ahead, dimly lit and eerily quiet, each step I took echoing in the emptiness. Something about the sound of my footsteps amplified the tension building in my chest. My destination was clear, Mr. Thomas's room. His earlier words about someone leaving tonight gnawed at my thoughts, refusing to be ignored. When I entered his room, I froze in the doorway. The sight that greeted me was entirely unexpected. Mr. Thomas, who had been in a coma for weeks, was sitting up in bed. He didn't appear groggy or confused. On the contrary, his posture was steady, his eyes clear, and his demeanor calm. A nurse stood by his bedside, adjusting his fore and fluffing his pillows, her expression as composed as if it were just another routine check-in. "Mr. Thomas," I stammered, trying to mask my shock, "you're awake?" He chuckled softly, the sound warm yet surreal under the circumstances. "Awake and feeling better than I have in years," he said, his voice carrying a steady clarity. "These nurses of yours sure know how to take care of a man." He glanced at the nurse, who nodded without hesitation, confirming that all vitals had been checked and everything appeared normal. "Routine," she seemed to say with her movements. But nothing about this felt routine to me. "How are you feeling?" I asked, my voice betraying the astonishment I tried to suppress. "Like I've been asleep for ages," he replied, his tone casual yet sincere. "But it's a good feeling, like waking up after the best rest of your life." He paused, studying my face with a hint of curiosity. "Is something wrong?" For a moment, I hesitated, debating how much to share. "Not at all," I said finally, forcing a smile. "I'm just glad to see you awake." After a pause, I pressed on. "Do you happen to remember anything from earlier tonight? Before you woke up?" His brow furrowed slightly as he considered my question. "Earlier tonight," he repeated. "No, nothing comes to mind." "Why do you ask?" I hesitated again, unsure how to frame my next words. "You mentioned something to me earlier about someone leaving tonight. Does that sound familiar at all?" He shook his head, his confusion evident. "I don't remember saying anything like that, Doc," he replied earnestly. "Are you sure it wasn't someone else?" I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral, but my mind raced. Could it have been a fleeting moment of semi-consciousness, a fragment of awareness lost now that he was fully awake? I wanted to believe it was that simple, but the memory of his earlier words, so clear, so deliberate, refused to let me go. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, or so it seemed. I went about my rounds, checking on patients and completing charts, yet I couldn't shake the strange, lingering tension. Around 5 a.m., just as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the horizon, I was paged to the ICU. A patient in room 314, a woman in her late 40s battling a series of chronic complications, had passed away in the early hours of the morning. As I scanned the notes on her chart, my gaze drifted down the hallway toward Mr. Thomas's room, which was situated just a few doors down from hers. The connection struck me like a jolt. "She's leaving tonight." His words reverberated through my thoughts, gaining new weight in light of what had happened. A peculiar quiet had settled over the floor, a stillness that felt different from the usual calm of a hospital morning. It was heavier, more profound, as though something unseen had transpired in those dark hours, leaving an invisible mark. I glanced back at Mr. Thomas's room, the door now closed, and couldn't help but wonder, had he somehow known? The thought clung to me like a shadow as I finished my shift. When I returned to his room later that day, Mr. Thomas was asleep again, his face serene and untroubled. For the first time since I'd started caring for him, he looked truly at peace. Over the following days, he continued to recover, surprising everyone with his strength and clarity. Yet he never mentioned that night again, and neither did I. It felt like an unspoken understanding between us, a shared experience that neither of us could fully explain or confront. To this day, whenever I walk past room 314, I feel the weight of that night pressing on my chest. It's a feeling I can't shake, no matter how much time passes, a reminder of the moments we can't fully understand, when the lines between life, death, and something beyond blur in ways we're not equipped to comprehend. Just one room away from where the woman had passed, the realization hit me like a sharp gust of cold air. She's leaving us tonight. Could Mr. Peterson have somehow known what was about to occur in the neighboring room? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and as the morning routine of the hospital began to unfold, nurses bustling about, patients waking to the sterile hum of the monitors, the heaviness from the night lingered. It was an intangible weight, an unshakable sense that something profound and unseen had happened during those shadowed hours. I never brought up the incident with Mr. Peterson again, nor did he ever mention it before he was discharged days later. When he left, he was sharp, vibrant even, like a man who had stepped out of a long dream with newfound clarity. Yet he made no reference to the cryptic words he'd uttered that night, and I didn't push him. It felt as though we had shared a moment too strange, too delicate, to put into words. But every time I pass that room, whether in the still of the night or the bustle of the day, I can't help but feel the echo of his words reverberate in my mind. Were they merely the ramblings of a man waking from a prolonged coma, or had he glimpsed something deeper, something none of us can fully grasp? I'll never know. Hospitals, especially at night, have a way of distorting reality. The steady buzz of fluorescent lights, the faint hum of machines, the rhythmic footsteps of night staff, it all seems normal until darkness falls. In that quiet, the building transforms. Shadows seem to stretch longer, corners feel darker, and every sound carries an edge of something more. It was during one such night that I found myself on the other side of the experience. This time, I wasn't the doctor, I was the patient. What was supposed to be a routine post-op observation following a minor surgery left me confined to a private room at the farthest end of a long, empty hallway. At first, I welcomed the solitude. The quiet was soothing, a break from the chaos of life, and the isolation felt peaceful. But as the hours crawled by, that sense of tranquility began to shift, morphing into something more sinister. The first night passed uneventfully, save for the occasional murmur of staff making their rounds. But by the second night, I began to notice things I couldn't explain. It started innocently enough, a faint creak of floorboards in the hall, a whisper of movement that seemed too soft to be deliberate. At first, I dismissed it as the usual sounds of a hospital at night, the kind of things you tune out after a while. But around 3 a.m., I woke to a distinct sound, footsteps. These weren't the brisk, purposeful strides of a nurse on duty. No, these were different, slow, deliberate, dragging as though whoever was walking was in no hurry. I sat up in bed, straining to listen as the steps grew louder, drawing closer to my door. My rational mind tried to reason it away. It's just someone doing late rounds, I told myself. Nothing unusual. But deep down, I knew something was off. The steps paused just outside my door, lingering there as though whoever, or whatever, was standing on the other side was deciding what to do next. I expected to hear a knock or the soft creak of the door opening, but there was nothing. Just silence. The absence of sound was somehow worse, stretching out until it became unbearable. My eyes flicked to the sliver of light beneath the door, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't the faint, blurred outline of someone passing by, nor was it a trick of the flickering hallway lights. This shadow was sharp, distinct, and utterly still. It was unmistakably human in shape, but it didn't move like one. I watched, my breath caught in my chest, as the shadow remained fixed, as if whoever cast it was standing perfectly still, watching me through the thin barrier of the door. My heart pounded in my chest, but I clung to rationality. Maybe it was a nurse checking on me and had paused briefly. Maybe they'd stepped away momentarily. But as the seconds dragged on and the shadow refused to budge, the knot in my stomach tightened. I strained to hear something, anything, that might explain the presence, but the silence was suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow receded, melting into the darkness as though it had never been there at all. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a product of my imagination. Between the medication, the post-surgical haze, and the eerie quiet of the hospital, it wasn't impossible that I'd conjured something out of nothing. When the nurse came to check my vitals, I mentioned the incident, framing it as a half-hearted joke. "I think I saw a shadow in the hallway last night," I said, chuckling to mask my unease. Her reaction, however, was anything but dismissive. She stiffened, her face betraying the flicker of something that looked like fear before she quickly composed herself. "Oh, it's probably just one of the night staff," she said, her tone forced, her words too practiced to feel genuine. The way she avoided meeting my gaze left me with an unsettled feeling that stayed with me long after she left the room. By the time the sun set that evening, my nerves were already frayed. I tried to distract myself, reading, listening to music, anything to keep my mind from wandering. But as the lights dimmed and the hospital fell into its eerie nighttime rhythm, that same oppressive tension crept back in. Midnight came and went, and for a while, I thought I might escape a repeat of the previous night. But then, at precisely 3 a.m., I heard it again, the slow, dragging footsteps. This time, I didn't wait for the shadow to appear. I sat frozen in my bed, clutching the blanket tightly, my eyes fixed on the bottom of the door. The footsteps stopped outside, just like before, and I felt the air in the room grow heavy. Then, as if summoned by my fear, the shadow returned, darker and sharper than before. It didn't simply stand outside the door, it pressed against the crack, as though trying to seep through into the room. For what felt like hours, I sat paralyzed, watching as the shadow shifted, almost like it was testing the boundaries of the doorframe. And then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The next day, I overheard a nurse speaking in hushed tones with another patient down the hall. The words shadow and hallway caught my attention, sending a fresh wave of unease through me. I realized I wasn't alone in what I'd seen. Whatever was haunting this hospital wasn't just my imagination, it was something far more real and far more terrifying. That was my last night in the hospital. I was discharged the following day, but the memory of those footsteps, that shadow, and the oppressive stillness of those 3 a.m. encounters remains vivid. Hospitals are meant to be places of healing, of recovery. But in those quiet, empty hours of the night, they can become something else entirely, a place where the veil between the known and the unknown grows thin, and shadows take on a life of their own. I spent the following day restless, unable to shake the unease that had settled deep within me. The memory of the shadow pressing itself against the crack of my door replayed over and over in my mind. When the nurse came to check on me, I mentioned it again, hoping for reassurance. But her expression turned guarded, and she quickly waved it off, insisting it was likely a side effect of my medication. Still, the way her eyes darted toward the hallway told me she knew more than she was letting on. It wasn't until later, when I overheard a conversation between two nurses outside my room, that I realized how deep this mystery went. "It's always around 3 a.m., one whispered. "And it's always near the end of the hall." Their hushed voices sent a fresh wave of dread through me. Whatever I had seen wasn't just in my head, it was real, and I wasn't the only one who'd encountered it. That night, I lay in bed, trying to fight the growing sense of inevitability. I felt like prey, waiting for the predator to return. Midnight passed, and the minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. By the time the clock neared 3 a.m., my heart was racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't want to see it again, but part of me knew there was no escaping it. And then, right on schedule, the slow, dragging footsteps began. My breath caught as the sound grew louder, closer, each step deliberate and unhurried. I gripped the blanket tightly, unable to move, as the shadow reappeared, darker and sharper than before. It didn't simply linger outside the door this time, it pressed against the small gap, as if testing the barrier, searching for a way inside. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating, and a deep chill settled over me. It wasn't just cold, it was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that carried with it the weight of something unnatural. I stared at the shadow, unable to tear my eyes away, as it began to shift. It didn't move like a person would, instead, it glided, almost fluid, across the hallway. My fear turned to horror as I watched it stop in front of the door across the hall, Mr. Will's room. It lingered there, unnaturally still, for what felt like an eternity before it did the unthinkable. The shadow, dark and amorphous, melted through the closed door, disappearing into his room as though the solid wood was nothing more than air. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what I'd just witnessed. The silence that followed was oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I strained to hear something, anything, from across the hall, but there was nothing. No cries for help, no sound of movement, just an empty, suffocating quiet. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. I barely slept, and when morning finally came, I was too exhausted to process the nurse's somber words. Mr. Wills had passed away in the night. "He went peacefully," she said, her tone calm and detached. But I knew better. The timing was too perfect, the events too aligned to be a coincidence. That shadow had something to do with it, I was certain of it. Later that day, I overheard another nurse whispering to a colleague. "It always happens at the same time," she said, her voice low. "Around 3 a.m. And it's always someone at the end of the hall. Her words sent a fresh chill through me, confirming my worst fears. This wasn't an isolated incident. Whatever was lurking in the hospital's shadows had a pattern, a purpose. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done. That night, I resolved to stay awake, determined to see it through to the end. If the shadow came back, I wanted to be ready. As the hours ticked by, I sat upright in bed, every nerve on edge. My bedside light cast a faint glow across the room, but it did little to chase away the oppressive darkness. By 2:45 a.m., I was gripping the edge of the blanket so tightly my knuckles ached. And then, as the clock struck 3 a.m., it began. The footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging, each one echoing down the hallway with a weight that made my chest tighten. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, as the shadow slid into view, darker and more defined than ever before. This time, it didn't hesitate. It moved with purpose, gliding across the hallway floor toward my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it press against the thin opening, its form shifting and twisting as though it were alive. The cold in the room became unbearable, seeping into every inch of me, and I knew there was no escaping it. The shadow wasn't just a trick of the light, it was something else entirely, something I couldn't begin to understand. It lingered there, testing the barrier, almost as if it was deciding whether to come inside. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to retreat. I watched, unable to look away, as it slid back down the hallway, pausing briefly before melting into the darkness once more. My entire body shook with relief, but the fear didn't leave me. I knew it wasn't over. The next morning, I was discharged, and as I left the hospital, I couldn't help but glance back at the hallway one last time. The sunlight streaming through the windows made it look ordinary, safe even, but I knew better. Whatever haunted those halls wasn't bound by the rules of the day. Even now, the memory of those nights lingers. Hospitals are places of healing, of recovery, but in those quiet, empty hours, they can become something else entirely. A place where shadows take on a life of their own, where the line between life and death blurs, and where the unknown watches from just beyond the light. I may have left that hospital behind, but a part of me knows I'll never truly escape it. That shadow, that presence, it's out there, waiting for its next moment, its next victim. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the suffocating dread of knowing it was coming for me. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered like a cold breath against my neck, refusing to let me feel at ease. By the time the morning light crept through the blinds, I was desperate to leave. I packed quickly, not caring about the neatness of my belongings, just wanting to escape the suffocating air of that place. I left the hospital without looking back, yet no distance could shake the feeling that something dark and unseen still lingered in those halls, biding its time. Even now, I sometimes catch myself wondering if it's still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul. It wasn't long after that I heard another story, one shared with hushed tones during the night shift by a nurse who, like me, had seen things she couldn't explain. Her story involved an elderly patient named Mr. Connors in room 216, a man who had been in a coma for weeks after a devastating stroke. He wasn't expected to wake up, and his care was mostly routine, checking his vitals, ensuring his floor was secure, adjusting his blankets when needed. Nights passed with the faint, rhythmic sound of his shallow breathing becoming part of the ambient hum of the ward. But something about his room always felt off. The nurse recounted how the air inside seemed heavier, like an invisible weight pressing down the moment you stepped through the door. She couldn't quite explain it, but it was palpable, an atmosphere that clung to her like static electricity. One particular night, close to 2 a.m., the feeling grew stronger. The hospital was eerily silent, save for the occasional distant creak of a cart or the faint hum of fluorescent lights. She remembered it being unnaturally cold that night, colder than it had any right to be even in a hospital. Pulling her sweater tighter, she pushed through her rounds, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. When she entered room 216, the chill hit her like a wall, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the hallway she'd just left. It wasn't the usual draft of air conditioning, it was bone deep, an iciness that seemed alive. She tried to dismiss it, to focus on checking Mr. Connor's monitors and adjusting his floor, but that prickling sensation at the back of her neck refused to fade. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination running wild during a long shift. But then, as she leaned closer to check his vitals, something happened that made her heart nearly stop. Without warning, Mr. Connors, who had been motionless for weeks, suddenly sat up. His movement wasn't gradual or sluggish, as one might expect from someone so weak. It was sharp, sudden, almost unnatural. His eyes snapped open and locked onto hers, wide and unblinking. She froze, unable to process what was happening. His gaze wasn't confused or disoriented, it was piercing, as though he were seeing something beyond her. And then he spoke, his voice raspy and weak, but filled with an eerie certainty. "He's coming for me," he whispered. The weight of those words hung heavy in the air, freezing her in place. The nurse managed to stammer out a question, asking who he meant, but before she could get an answer, his eyes rolled shut, and his body slumped back onto the bed. The shallow, mechanical rhythm of his breathing returned as if nothing had happened. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her mind racing to make sense of what she'd just seen. Had it been some sort of reflex? A final burst of energy, as people sometimes experienced near the end? That's what she tried to tell herself as she backed out of the room, her hands trembling. But no rational explanation could erase the sound of his voice, the certainty in his words. "He's coming for me." It wasn't just a phrase, it was a warning. When she returned to the nurse's station, she tried to mask her unease, but one of her colleagues noticed how pale she was. Brushing it off as a chill, she forced a weak laugh and blamed the cold air. Yet the truth gnawed at her, refusing to let go. After a few minutes of restless pacing, she decided to check on Mr. Connors again, hoping to reassure herself that what she'd experienced was nothing more than a strange coincidence. As she stepped back into the room, the air was just as heavy as before, but this time, there was something else. The silence felt different, charged, like the moments before a storm. She hesitated, glancing at the monitors and the still figure on the bed. His breathing was shallow but steady, his face calm. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if she'd imagined it all. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw something shift in the shadows near the corner of the room. She turned sharply, her heart pounding, but the corner was empty, just a trick of the dim lighting, she told herself. Still, the unease lingered as she finished her shift. She couldn't shake the memory of his words, nor the way he had looked at her, as if he were looking through her, at something just behind her. And though she never spoke of it again, she kept a wary eye on room 216 during every subsequent shift, unwilling to linger there longer than necessary. A few nights later, she overheard a conversation between two nurses on the floor. They were discussing Mr. Connors, how he had passed away peacefully during the night. One of them remarked on how calm he'd seemed, as though he had been waiting for it. The nurse's stomach twisted as she recalled his final words. "He's coming for me." She couldn't help but wonder if he'd known, if he'd sensed something approaching in those final moments. To this day, she avoids talking about what happened in room 216. But sometimes, when the hospital is quiet and the air grows heavy with that same oppressive stillness, she feels it again, that same chilling certainty that something unseen lingers in the shadows, watching, waiting. And whenever she passes by the empty room where Mr. Connors once lay, she quickens her pace, unwilling to let the shadows linger too long in her peripheral vision. As I pushed open the door to Mr. Connors' room, an icy chill ran through me at the sight of his empty bed. My first thought was that the staff might have moved him for a late-night test, even though I knew it was unlikely. Still, I checked the sheets, they were still warm, as if he had only just been there moments ago. Panic began to creep in as I hurried back to the nurse's station, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Did someone move Mr. Connors?" I asked, my words tumbling out too quickly. The nurses exchanged confused glances, their expressions mirroring my growing anxiety. "Move him? What are you talking about?" one of them asked, her brow furrowing. "He's gone," I managed to say, my voice betraying the panic I was trying to suppress. "He's not in his room." Their puzzled looks turned to alarm as we quickly organized a search, scouring the floor, checking every room, every supply closet, even the stairwells. But there was no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The more we searched, the heavier the cold settled over me, sinking into my bones. His words echoed relentlessly in my mind, "He's coming for me." The eerie certainty in his voice took on a new, sinister weight. Finally, one of the nurses suggested we check the security footage. We crowded around the monitor as the security guard rewound the tape, the tension in the room palpable. At first, everything appeared normal, Mr. Connors lying still in his bed, exactly as I'd left him. And then, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the frame. My stomach turned. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and his movements were unnervingly smooth, almost gliding. Without hesitation, he approached the bed and leaned over Mr. Connors, lifting him with a practiced ease that seemed far too calculated. He placed Mr. Connors into a wheelchair he had brought with him, the process disturbingly calm, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. We watched in stunned silence as the man wheeled Mr. Connors out of the room, down the empty hallway, and out of sight. He didn't encounter a single nurse, didn't trigger any alarms. It was as if he knew every detail of the hospital's layout, every blind spot, every opportunity to remain unseen. It was too perfect, too deliberate. It sent a shiver down my spine. The police were called immediately, and the footage was handed over to investigators. They interviewed each of us, trying to piece together how someone could walk into a hospital, remove a patient, and disappear without anyone noticing. But none of us had answers. We were just as baffled as they were. The footage had captured everything, but beyond the moment they left the building, there was no trace of them. It was as if they had vanished into the night. The following days were a blur of inquiries and restless nights. The police called frequently, asking for additional details or clarification, but the mystery only deepened. Mr. Connors and the mysterious man were nowhere to be found. And yet, I couldn't stop replaying the image in my mind, the man's unnerving calm, Mr. Connors' still, compliant form, and the eerie weight of his final words. "He's coming for me." It felt less like a warning now and more like a declaration, an inevitability he had somehow known all along. Nearly a week later, the case took an unexpected turn. The police located the man in the security footage. He was identified as Mr. Connors' son, and his story revealed a heartbreaking truth. Years ago, Mr. Connors had made his son promise that he would never let him die in a hospital. He had spent his life fearing the sterile, impersonal environment of those cold rooms, believing them to be places where people went to fade away, forgotten. His son had come that night to honor a pact they had made long ago, a final act of love and defiance. They were found in a remote farmhouse several towns away. Mr. Connors was weak, barely able to sit up, but he had refused to return to the hospital. He passed away 2 weeks later, his son by his side, exactly as he had wanted. It was a tragic yet oddly comforting ending, a son fulfilling his father's last wish, ensuring he left this world on his own terms. And yet, despite the clarity the discovery brought, I couldn't shake the image of that night. The way Mr. Connors had sat up, eyes wide, and spoken those chilling words, as though he had foreseen it all. "He's coming for me." It wasn't just a statement, it was a certainty, a knowing that transcended explanation. Even now, I replay that night in my mind, trying to make sense of the impossible. The hospital, with its sterile halls and hum of machinery, had always felt like a place grounded in logic and order. But in the quiet hours of the night, when shadows stretched long and the air grew heavy, it became something else entirely. A place where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred, and where the unseen seemed to linger, watching, waiting. It wasn't long after that I began working the night shift as a hospital security guard. The job seemed straightforward enough, patrolling the halls, ensuring everything was secure, and keeping an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered near the morgue. Hospitals at night are unsettling in a way that's hard to describe. There's a stillness, an almost oppressive quiet, broken only by the faint hum of machinery or the occasional echo of a distant footstep. The air feels heavier, the shadows darker. I'd always dismissed the unease as a trick of the mind, a product of overactive imagination. But one particular night near the morgue shattered that illusion completely. It started like any other shift, routine rounds, checking locked doors, and noting flickering lights in the stairwell. But as the clock ticked past midnight, something shifted. The air grew colder, a sharp, unnatural chill that prickled at the back of my neck. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to the hospital's overzealous air conditioning. But the deeper I ventured into the basement, the stronger the feeling became. By the time I reached the morgue, it was almost unbearable. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows on the walls. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, low and indistinct, coming from somewhere within the morgue. My blood ran cold. I told myself it was just the ventilation system, a distant echo of sound carried through the ducts. But deep down, I knew better. Summoning what courage I could, I stepped closer, my flashlight cutting through the dim light. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I realized they weren't random. They were calling my name. Each hour, I was required to sweep through the basement, ensuring every door was locked, every corner secured. It was an eerie routine, especially on a night like this when the hospital felt emptier than usual. With only a handful of patients and a skeleton crew of staff scattered across the upper floors, the halls were unnervingly silent, their usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive stillness. By the time the clock neared midnight, the basement had become uncomfortably cold, a sharp, biting chill that seemed to seep through the walls and into my skin. Hospitals were always cool, but this was different. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the kind of cold that felt alive, pressing against me, making every step feel heavier. As I reached the corridor leading to the morgue, I noticed the lights at the far end flickering faintly. At first, I dismissed it as another faulty bulb, something I'd seen countless times before. Still, I added it to the mental checklist of maintenance issues to report at the end of my shift. But as I walked closer, the flickering grew stranger, almost rhythmic, as though the lights were pulsing in time with my footsteps. I forced myself to ignore the prickling unease crawling up my spine, silently repeating, "It's just a light. It's just a hallway." Yet my attempts to rationalize did little to calm the knot tightening in my chest. As I approached the morgue's main door, the flickering stopped, plunging the corridor into an unsettling stillness. I paused, straining to hear any sound, anything to cut through the silence. And then, faintly, I heard it, a low, indistinct murmur. My heart leaped into my throat. At first, I convinced myself it was just the ventilation system, the sound of air rushing through old ducts. But the more I listened, the more it became clear, this wasn't the mechanical hum of a building. It was a voice. A soft, insistent whisper just beyond the door. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and walk away. But I was a security guard. It was my job to investigate. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The morgue was dimly lit, its sterile surfaces glinting faintly under the weak overhead lights. At a glance, everything seemed normal. The tables were empty, the drawers shut tight. But the air inside was thick, heavy with a chill that seemed to cling to my skin. As I stepped further in, the door creaked behind me, its sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. I scanned the room with my flashlight, its beam cutting through the dimness as I checked every corner, every shadow. For a moment, I thought I was alone. But then, the whisper came again, clearer this time. It was calling my name. My breath caught in my throat. The sound wasn't distant now, it was close, intimate, as though someone were standing just behind me. "Derek," it said, low and pleading. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was nothing there, just empty air. The rational part of my brain fought to assert control. "It's just your imagination. You're tired. You're hearing things." But the fear gnawing at my chest was impossible to ignore. I stepped further into the room, drawn toward the sound despite every fiber of my being telling me to leave. And then, I heard something new, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the far end of the room, soft yet deliberate, like fingers drumming against metal. My flashlight swung toward the source, illuminating the wall of cold storage drawers. The sound stopped the moment the light landed on them. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I turned back toward the door, ready to leave, when a sudden chill brushed the back of my neck, like the icy breath of someone standing far too close. I whipped around, my flashlight darting through the room, but once again, there was nothing. My hands were shaking now, the fear coursing through me too strong to suppress. But before I could move, the tapping resumed, louder and more insistent. It was no longer coming from the wall of drawers. It was coming from the shadows just beyond my flashlight's reach. My knees felt weak, my body screaming at me to run, but I was rooted in place, unable to tear myself away from the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before, filling the room with an unbearable tension. I turned toward the door, my steps unsteady, when I heard it again, a new sound, faint and distant at first, but growing steadily louder. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing down the hallway outside. They weren't hurried or clumsy like those of a distracted staff member. They were measured, each step falling with an eerie precision that sent chills down my spine. I hesitated, debating whether to leave or stay. But the footsteps didn't give me a choice. They were coming closer. I edged toward the door, my flashlight flickering slightly as I gripped it tightly. The footsteps continued, steady and relentless, until they reached just beyond the door. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sound, but there was nothing else, just the oppressive stillness and those maddeningly slow steps. The handle of the door creaked faintly, and my heart stopped. Someone, or something, was on the other side. I wanted to run, to flee back up the stairs and never look back, but my legs wouldn't move. The door didn't open. Instead, the footsteps began to move again, this time retreating down the hall. I waited, listening as they grew fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely. The silence that followed was almost worse, stretching endlessly as I stood there, frozen in fear. Finally, I forced myself to move, backing out of the room with my flashlight held high. I didn't bother with my usual checks or notes. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. As I reached the staircase leading back to the main floor, I cast one last glance over my shoulder. The corridor was empty, the lights flickering faintly once more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, hiding just beyond the edges of the light. That night, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the stress of the job getting to me. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever was in that morgue, it wasn't just my imagination. It was real. And it wasn't finished.